Hello and welcome to week 47 of this 52-week series for the Web Pro on what every web administrator needs to know to be successful in this space. My name is Scott Forsyth, and today I want to pick up where I left off last week on IIS FTP. And so I was planning to do 4 weeks, but actually I'm going to branch it into 5 and spend more time today talking about some of the theory behind active and passive FTP. And so it may be more information than you wanted, I'm not sure, but I find it fascinating and hopefully you find it worthwhile and also helps you with some more advanced troubleshooting just to really understand some of the differences. We'll also talk about FTP over SSL or over TLS and understanding some of that as well. So let's look at active versus passive FTP and understand this. Here's what's so different about FTP is, in fact, FTP, the protocol, the original RFC, was way back in 1971, way before the internet came really into the existence that we know now. And so it's RFC 114. And so way back then, we didn't have a lot of the considerations that we do right now. And that's why active FTP, we'd probably consider it legacy, although it's still used today. And so let's take a look at what happens. So here on the diagram we have on the left our FTP client computer. So in my case I'm going to use FileZilla, but you can use whatever FTP client you want. And we have our FTP server. You can use what you want, but we're really covering IIS is kind of the focus here. And of course we have potential firewalls in between, and so we need to make sure that we have the rules in place there. So what makes FTP so fascinating is there's actually 2 channels. It's unlike, let's say, HTTP. You have port 80, a standard request comes in, plain and simple. With FTP, we have what's called a control channel, which comes in, and I've represented that here in green, and the request come back and forth. And then we have what's called the data channel, and that's where the larger data is transferred back and forth. So here's the big difference between active and passive is the data channel, the second part of it, who initiates, and here you can see it's kind of in yellow, the client is actually the one who's going to be listening to. They're the ones that says, hey, come back to me over this particular port. Now let me switch to passive here. And so passive is almost the same, except this top bar here, notice it's reversed. Now what happens is this one's in yellow because it's a server that says come back to me. And you can see both these darker firewall holes. And so those are representing the incoming requests. These ones are representing the out. So let me switch back here to active. And notice how this one switched. It reversed direction. And that's the key difference between that. So here's what happens. Let's watch the flow. Active FTP, a request leaves the server, the client's end. It comes through here, and it's going to come through port 21. And the server is going to talk back to the client. And when the client sends that request, it's going to give the instruction here and say, come continue talking to me over this other port. And it's going to be 1 greater than what it used. If this is n down here, it's going to be n plus 1. So then the server is going to initiate a request back through the new hole on this end that the client has to be listening to establish. Now it's not an existing already established session. It's a brand new session that has to be created. And that's the gotcha. And you can imagine here a lot of client servers, if you're behind a NAT device or corporate firewalls, corporate environments, you're going to have a lot of issues. And I mean, even just standard ISPs are not normally meant to take that active request that has a new session that's initiated. So now if we switch to passive FTP, what happens is the client sends a request to the server. Now the server here at this point says, okay, come back to me on port X. Okay, so we'll call it N here, or M I should say. So we go back again, the instruction is given to the client. Now a fresh outgoing request is made to the server to this new higher port in this range. But notice even passive FTP can be a problem because every one of these ports for every connection has to be unique. It doesn't share like it does in these other ones. So for example, let's say we come back and we're going to say, let's say the range starts at 5,000. Well, the first connection is going to be 5,000. The next one, 501, 502. If you have 100 users connecting to the server at the same time, you need 100 ports. So basically you need as many ports open as there are the max amount of users simultaneous. Out of the box, it's the whole range of 102.4 or greater. But we can set that to a smaller range, which we'll want to do. And I'll show this later. Okay, so hopefully this made sense. And I'll come back and probably look at this diagram here as we go through. But let's actually take a look at some of the traffic and look at how this works. Okay, so let's take a look at the servers I've set up. I've set up 2. we have the one I'm calling FTP server, and I've set up so let's say it's all disabled, and incoming everything is disabled except for remote desktop, which I need right now to use this. And also in the properties of the firewall, notice I've changed the outbound connections to block, which they aren't by default. So this is locked down much more than most environments would normally be. Basically, all the rules have been blocked. I mean, right now, I can't even ping the gateway. Okay, so I have no access except via FTP or remote desktop I'm coming in as. And the same on the client side. So what I've done is I've disabled all but remote desktop. And for outbound, let's disable this for now. So right now we have no access whatsoever. So let's determine what we need to do to give exactly the access that we need through. So let's look at the diagram. Okay, so let's start with active FTP. So we need to, on the client side, to allow 1024 to 21. Then we need to, and then of course it comes back with an established session, so no new firewall port. So we need an outgoing here. We need an incoming of 21. We need an outgoing of 20 and an incoming from 20 to 1024 or greater. Okay, so let's try this. Okay, so on the client side, for outbound rule, we need to go to 21 from 1024 or greater. And then inbound, we actually have to have this open. So 1024 from 20. Let's enable that. On the server side, we need to, now I'm actually using the rules that were created when IIS-FTP was installed. And so we want the FTP server, and this is, we could have created our own, but this is basically port 21. It's actually scoped specifically to the SVC host and also to the Microsoft FTP server. So this is locked down even further than if we had just done the port. But so we have 21 incoming, so let's enable that. And then also we need to allow an outgoing. And again, the default that's here already is using port 20. And again, it's scoped specifically to this. Okay, so we're going to enable this. Let's see if this works. Go to our FTP client. Let's fire up FileZilla. And let's use plain FTP, and we're going to use active. And I have a user called FTP Scott. So connect. Oh, yes. This has worked the first try. And we see this coming in. Now here's what's interesting right here is notice the command that the FTP client has sent, this is this side, is this port, and it's going to be 10.240, 6.252. So within the commas, the first four are the IP address of the other server. And then this is kind of fun. You see this 193.190. So let's pull up our calculator. And what this is it's going to be 193 times 256 plus 190. So 49598 is the port that the client FTP is going to give in instructions. So if we actually fire up Wireshark, which I have Wireshark set up and it's filtered to just listen to the traffic between the two computers. So the source computer and CR 49598. And you can see it here, and this is the data channel, is the 598. But the 597 is a control channel. You can see the difference between them. Now let me show you something here I mentioned a couple weeks ago. And FTP, in the protocol here, it's going to ask for the user, FTP user, and then it says the password is required. Okay, the server is going to say, now the client, look at this. It responds, and you can, obviously I changed my password to make it one that I don't care if you see it. And it says you can see my password. This is actually my password you can see in plain text. So you don't want to use regular FTP if at all possible. Anyone on the network between you and the server can see that completely. So you see the whole conversation going on. Okay, so this showed us active FTP. Now passive FTP is a little bit different. The first two steps are exactly the same, but now we need to allow outgoing. The rule is already going to be here, and we want to allow incoming 1024 or greater. So let's set that up now instead. Okay, so back on the client, in the firewall, we don't have to have the inbound rule anymore. And here's where it gets easier to manage. So, because really, wouldn't we assume it's the server's job to have the firewall ports open and not the client? That's really how the internet is. And so that's why passive, it makes so much more sense in most situations. Okay, so we now have, this has been closed out, and then we have the outgoing to 21 from 1024. But we also want to open up to 1024 from 102.4 or greater. So that's been opened now too. And then on the server side, our outbound, we don't have to worry about this anymore. We can disable this. But our inbound, we want to also turn on the passive port range. And let's enable that. And let's also look at what it does. And the key part of it is we're going to go the local port from coming into 102.4 to the whole range, 65535. So let's give this a try. And we're going to go and switch now to passive mode. And let's connect. And yes, we have success. And in fact, this is kind of interesting. Let me show you this. If we were to block just the one part, let's go back to the FTP server. And we're going to block this server, the passive part. So we're going to disable this one here, which is going to be used for the data part. Okay, let's close, reopen, and try to connect. Now, look at this. It's all green so far, but we don't see a directory listing yet. It's still working in the background. This is because the control channel has worked, but the data channel has not. So it's an advanced troubleshooting to understand the difference here, because you're part way through. And in a few seconds, this is going to time out. So while we wait for this to time out, let's look here. It says entering passive mode. There, timed out. We see PASV, entering passive mode, and we see the first four sections are the IP address, and then we see this 192. So let's try it. 192 times 256, and we're going to plus 206. And that's going to give us 49358. We should expect to see this in Wireshark. And if we take a look at it here, we see it right here, 49358. So you can see, and that's all going to be the data channel. So, but see, the communication was not on this at first. It was actually via 21 on this side with whatever it is on that side. And then also this one here established with one port higher on the client side. Okay, so this gives us our back and forth here. So let's go and fix that. We go here and we're going to enable this rule here on the passive side. So we'll go and confirm that we're good again. And we are. Okay, so this gives us the difference between active and passive, and basically it's which side gives the instruction and who listens on the data channel. In fact, let's look at this. In IS-FTP, it is possible to control some of the SSL settings regarding those. If we go here to our FTP SSL settings and go to Custom, Advanced, we can see here that our control channel with SSL we can allow or require, or we can require it only for the credentials part. And then on the data side, we can allow, require, or actually deny. So for example, let's say you feel it's too resource intensive for all the data to be encrypted, but you want to make sure that the credentials are. It's possible to do that. But by default, it's allow and allow. Or actually, by default, it's really require and require. But I often switch it to allow and let the client make the decision. But if some server administrators and requirements, you may make this an absolute requirement. In fact, it wouldn't be unwise at all to use that. But for now, because we're testing both, let's do this.
So a question you may be asking is why on your computer or in your dedicated firewall did you only have to enable port 21 and you didn't have to enable the range 102.4 and greater? And the reason for this is stateful FTP is something that both the Windows firewall supports and many hardware firewalls support. So let's take a look here in the Windows firewall. If we do a NetSH Advanced Firewall Show Global and hit enter, notice we have this feature called stateful FTP, and it's currently disabled on the server at the moment. And what this enables is as that traffic goes back and forth, remember we have our data channel and we have the control channel. When the communication goes back and forth on the data channel, this server, the firewall, actually eavesdrops on the communication back and forth and says, okay, I know where you're coming back to, and even though it's a new request, I'm going to be sitting here waiting and I'm going to trust that request on the way back. So stateful FTP allows it to maintain that state even though it's two separate channels. Okay, here's the gotcha. This works completely fine as long as the firewall supports it. However, once we get into secure FTP, we can't do that anymore because the firewall is no longer able to eavesdrop on that communication. And so then we have to make sure that we're more explicit on which ports are enabled there. And because I do recommend that we don't just use the plain wide open FTP, the stateful FTP then is going to be no longer applicable moving forward, and you need to be very specific in which ports you're enabling. So this leads us into the discussion on secure FTP and the difference between explicit and implicit FTP. So for example, let's go to our client, fire up FileZilla again, and notice here we have the difference between require explicit FTP and also implicit. And previously I'd mentioned to use explicit, and really that's the way things are. Implicit is deprecated, although it does work. And also there's the same decisions there between active and passive. But let's hang out in the passive setting here. So here's the difference. If we connect with explicit FTP, and notice here at the top we issue a command right off at the beginning of the conversation saying I'm going to be using auth TLS versus, let's say, auth SSL. And this means that throughout the communication you can have a different control channel and data channel setting. Whereas implicit, it's implied that it's always secure. There's no decision made back and forth. And the ports will work differently as well. So I've set this up, and I'll show you the firewall ports that I enabled to do this. So on the client server, there's nothing inbound because we're using passive mode, so only outbound. And we're going to port 21 from the high range, and also that's going to be for the control channel. And for the data channel, we have 1024, that whole range to the whole range. On the server side, it's going to be nothing in the outbound, because everything's inbound with passive FTP. But we have two things here. The FTP server, it's using port 21, and then we have this high range here, the high ports, and that allows this to work. Okay, so let's take a look now at implicit and see what settings we would do. And here's how you set it with IIS-FTP. And so if we go here to our bindings, notice that we're bound to port 21. So the way that you set it, it's also implicit, really, which is IIS-FTP has a lot of things that are implied. And so true to form, we can switch this to 990. And so basically, if this port is set to 990, it's going to use implicit SSL. Everything else will be explicit. So we're going to put 990 and hit close. We're also going to have to change our firewall ports. And so now, rather than port, it's this rule right here, that's 21. We're going to disable that one because we don't need it now. And instead we're going to use this FTP server right here for port 990. So we're going to enable that. Now I'll tell you, if you're using active mode, then 989, TCP port 989 comes into play on the outbound rule / inbound rule on the client. But since we're going to be using passive mode, we don't have to worry about that. Okay, now on the client, we do have to change our firewall. Again, only because we have this lockdown more than reason. So rather than to port 21, we're disabling it. It's going to port 990. Okay, so let's give it a try. So we're going to connect. Now notice if we tried to connect to this, if I had left those open, and with explicit with those settings, of course it's not going to work for two reasons. One, the port's denied, but two, the FTP itself is not listening. But if we now go to implicit and connect, notice that we're all the way through. And again, if we were to go to Wireshark, you'd see that conversation back and forth with port 990 in play and the higher range ports. Okay, so now we've shown explicit, implicit, secure FTP. Our final discussion is how do we lock down that range so it's a much smaller range. Really, it's kind of messy to have such a large range and having to open it. And so what we can do is at the server level, on the server itself, we're going to go to our firewall support, and it defaults to 00, but let's do 5,000, and let's say, well, if it's a shared web server, you may want to open up 1,000 ports. If you just have 1 or 2 or 3 people using it, let's do a smaller range. Let's give it, let's say, just 100, or you could even do smaller. So we're going to save that and apply, and of course it reminds us to change the firewall, and so we'll do that in a minute. And you do also need to restart the service. So the Microsoft FTP service, let's restart that. Okay, so now we have a smaller range. We can be a lot more specific in our rules. And so now let's go to our firewall. And rather than this one, it was this one here, 1024 to 65535. Let's disable that one. And we're going to enable a custom one I created. And I'll show you what that one does. And that goes to, we can do 5,000 to 5,100. So just the 100 ports that we set. And again, you can just make it 10 if it's not meant for a lot of shared people at the same time. So let's go to the client, and let's see if this still works with implicit. And it does. So implicit mode, this still works. And just real quickly, we're going to switch back over to explicit, back on the server. And remember to do that, we just changed this from port 21, or from 990 to 21, or you could do a custom one if you want to go outside the default. And on the firewall, rather than using this 990, we're going to disable that, and we're going to use the 21, this one here. We'll do the same thing on the client, and rather than 990, we're going to use 21, and let's give it a go. So explicit, using passive mode, connect, and you can see how it works. So this wraps up our discussion on active passive and the secure implicit and explicit and the differences. A lot of theory here. It's not something that's easy to skim, but I hope you find it useful, especially if you do any troubleshooting with FTP. Having this foundation makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot whatever you're doing there. So thanks for tuning in. We're going to do one more week on FTP. Next week I'm going to touch base on how to do some more advanced troubleshooting. Also, I'll bring up the topic briefly on FTP host headers. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later.